Go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. All the things you want to know about working with interpreters with Professor Carla Mathers. My name is Peggy Cadwell, and I am the ADA coordinator for the New Mexico courts. The New Mexico statewide Title II ADA office has had the privilege of working with Professor Mathers for years, and we're happy to bring you today's presentation. I would like to welcome all of our New Mexico judiciary employees, as well as those of you who are joining us from all over the country today. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted later on our YouTube channel, and we will give you post that address on the chat. As a reminder, today's presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Professor Mathers will address questions at the end of their presentation, so please type those into the chat box. And with that, I leave you all in good hands with Professor Mathers. Carla?
Thank you, Peggy, and welcome, everyone. It's good to see you all. First of all, I want to thank Peggy and her team at the New Mexico Administrative Office of the Courts, statewide ADA Title II Coordinator's Office, for having me at this program. I'm getting more and more familiar with New Mexico. I get to spend a lot of time with your interpreters, so I'm thrilled to work with the providers now. My name is Carla. I am licensed to practice law in Maryland. I was in the District of Columbia and Maryland for 25 years and I was a sign language interpreter before I became an attorney. So at the time that I semi-retired, I kept my Maryland law license and continued to teach court interpreters how to work, either in court or out of court in legal settings like attorney-client conferences. In addition, I'm a practicing court interpreter. I work on a contractual basis with the DC courts, as well as our federal courts, as well as the state and federal courts in the Maryland and Virginia area, because we're a very small unit. So that's what I'm currently doing. I'm both interpreting and teaching. So next slide, please. The title may be a little bit ambitious, certainly for a 1-hour session, and it might leave you with questions, but that's good because then you can find answers to those. But my whole goal is to try to bring a little clarity to the work of ASL interpreters, because it's similar to, though not exactly the same as, working with Spanish or spoken language interpreters. And I want to highlight those differences. But for the most part, we're all working with 2 different languages, and we're all officers of the court, and we're sworn to interpret accurately. So I want to give you some background on the deaf community. There's a tremendous variety of communication approaches in the community. And there's a lot of reasons why, but mainly it's because how and when the deaf person learned to sign. It might sound weird because most of us learned language at our parents' knees, but most deaf people didn't, because most deaf people, 90% of them, have parents who can hear. And so they don't use the same language. They don't have any language when they're born. Their parents, during those critical language learning years, are often struggling to come to grips with the fact that they have a disabled child. And so they go to the medical community because that's who they've been interacting with since the birth of the child. And they are offering sometimes surgical interventions, which is a nice way of saying brain surgery on your baby, which is not a real exciting prospect if you're a new parent. And sadly, some of those interventions aren't successful. Some are, some aren't. But very little information is given to parents early on about options that are trying to acclimate the child to a visual language like American Sign Language. That, when it happens, usually happens after that birth to age 3, 4, 5 time frame. That's really critical for learning not only language, but we learn how to use language. We learn when we're being rude, we learn how to be persuasive, we learn all of those things coming up. Those things are sometimes missing for deaf people, at least for most of them. For the 10% who have deaf parents, it's a different story. But essentially what that means is that the opportunity for a native fluency or native-like fluency in any language is lost. So let's see. What we do, or what the court system does, statutorily and otherwise, is to provide interpreters as accommodations, and not only interpreters, though the bulk of this presentation focuses on that as an accommodation. But for some deaf people, they don't use sign language and they still need accommodations. So there are a variety of them. We'll talk about those types of interpreting. But if you think about it like this, it all depends on when you learn language. So if you became deaf tomorrow, you have a strong language base in English, at least. You probably don't know any visual language, and you might rely on text-based communications or accommodations. And those are frequently provided by the court. And then we also have an interpreter that just, if you did learn some kind of visual form of English, which we call signed English, we have an interpreter called a transliterator who would be able to listen to English and sign it word for word in English word order so that you would comprehend it. Now, if you were one of the deaf people who didn't have a strong language, you would use American Sign Language. And we have another kind of interpreter called an ASL interpreter who would accommodate those needs. So we'll talk about not only those two general types of interpreting, but a number of different specialty types when you have unique needs presented by the deaf person. One of the keys for attorneys is to make sure that the interpreter has an opportunity to assess how the deaf person communicates. And part of that is asking their language background, not talking about the case, but the interpreter, who is generally certified, can interpret in signed English or can interpret using American Sign Language, but they need to interact with the deaf person to find out what they prefer. And that's actually the best piece of advice I could give you anyway, is if you have a deaf client, or if you're bringing a deaf, or if a court is providing accommodations, just ask the deaf person, what do you want? How can you best communicate with us? An interpreter, or do you want some other kind of an accommodation? They know best what they need. Okay, and I'll talk about different ways to make that interaction successful, to make sure that the interpreter has what they need in order to accurately interpret, and that you have what you need in order to ensure that your communications are privileged. And then some final tips and takeaways that hopefully will answer some of the questions you have. We're ready for the next slide, Anne. So I've talked about language variation and why it happens. There's more to it, but in general, it deals with when and how the deaf person learns sign. But we also have foreign deaf people, people who come from another country and are maybe completely fluent in their signed languages. We also have something called regionalisms or accents from various places within the United States. So just like we do in English, but in English, they're not unintelligible. And in ASL, they're not really unintelligible, but certain lexical items or signs are used specifically in that area, and you can identify people where they're from or where they learned based on the signs that they used. So it's like, it has an economic tie to it. Deaf people congregate traditionally where there are employment opportunities for them. So like back in the day, like in the 50s and 60s, everyone knew that Seattle had a huge deaf community because they had a Boeing factory. And deaf people were very adept at being able to go through a plane being manufactured and see where bolts were missing, because the light would come through the bolts hole, and then they would be able to point those out. So they were uniquely qualified for that kind of a job. So we have a huge community there. We have a huge community in my area, which is Washington, D.C., because the federal government has always, or at least since the 70s, had an affirmative obligation to provide employment opportunities. And we also have a major university that serves deaf people. So it served as a place for congregations, and it caused people to sign, people who are together frequently talk about the same things. And so there are regionalisms. But it does have an economic tie into it. Still and all, the vast majority of deaf people in the United States and in most of Canada use American Sign Language. Some people, as I said, sign a form of English that has various names too. And then there are deaf people who, like, if I became deaf tomorrow, or maybe I'm not a good example because I know sign. If you became deaf tomorrow, you might prefer to read lips. And in that instance, we have, not surprisingly, a certification for an interpreter who would sit in front of the deaf person who doesn't know sign and would repeat whatever the speaker is saying, word for word, without voice, so that their deaf person can look at them and just read lips. That way, when the presenter turns their back, or if the presenter has a large amount of facial hair, like a beard or a mustache, which can impede lip reading, then the interpreter would be there just to repeat word for word in English what was being said. It's calling that person as an interpreter is a misnomer, because they're not doing any change of the language. They're working within English, spoken English, and they're presenting it in a silent form of the same language. So they really are more like a transliterator, which is the interpreter who signs straight in English. Then there's a whole group of people called hard of hearing people, who may or may not know sign language, depending on where and when they became hard of hearing, and how. So that excludes a majority of older Americans who are losing their hearing. They're not part of this community because they didn't grow up in it. They probably never learned sign language. Courts may still accommodate them with different technology solutions like captioning, or they have FM loop systems that increase the volume to a person wearing a hearing aid. But there's also a large community of hard of hearing people who consider themselves to be part of the deaf community because they grew up using sign language, maybe from their family or from interactions at school. And I think the key for you is to know that they may speak well, and you may be able to understand them clearly, but just because a hard of hearing person speaks well doesn't mean that they will understand what you're saying. It depends on how much they can hear, and that varies and can be progressive. So at one point in their life, they might hear a lot, and then that may change over time. So I think the major complaint I've heard from hard of hearing people is sometimes when I talk to a lawyer, I won't use my voice at all. I won't speak, because if I speak, they think I can hear them when they talk, and I can't. So again, the same kind of remedy would be just to ask them how they're most comfortable communicating with you, or what they need. All right. So I wanted to talk a bit about lip reading. That's what the oral interpreters are doing. And it's a common question that we're asked, is whether or not deaf people can read lips. Lip reading requires you to first understand the language, right? You have to have a strong base in English before you can understand someone who is, or before you can try to speech read another person. Think about it, and you use a lot of contextual cues. So if you're watching television, you or me, and we turn off the sound and we're watching a news broadcast and it's the weather, we're going to see the background of the maps. We're going to see chevrons come up and give us a little bit of information, assuming no captioning. It'll be easier to catch some of the words that the broadcaster is saying because we have context and we have a strong base in the language. But if we went to another country like Japan and tried to watch the same broadcast in Japan, unless you know Japanese, turned the sound off and tried to figure out, you'd get the topic from the background context, but it would be very difficult to read their lips because you don't have a base in that language. And that's the situation that most deaf people find themselves in, is that they don't have a strong base in English. So it's very difficult to read someone's lips. So I found the next slide, Anne. I found a little graphic to just demonstrate that. If we can have the next slide, please. Oh, it may be there. I can't actually see what you're looking at. There you go. Take a moment and read that. That's pretty much, I think, what I've heard from deaf people is that it's extremely tiring. It depends upon guesswork, which is that contextual ability to try to figure things out. But if you think about it, most of language that when you're producing, it happens in your throat. It's not on various configurations of your lips. It's in the back of your throat. So that's just one example of that. We can go to the next slide. So in the United States, we have an organization called the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID. They provide examinations for sign language interpreters. They will test interpreters in a variety of settings to make sure that they are effectively interpreting. They specifically exclude legal settings in all of their tests. So it's not enough for an interpreter to say, I'm certified, because certified as a generalist means you've been tested in things other than legal. So legal interpreters need to have something else. There's another organization called the Board of Evaluators, I think is what it is. Nobody ever uses the full title. They call it BEI, but it's the Board of Evaluation of Interpreters. It's a Texas organization. And they have a general exam that one has to take. And then you can sit for a specialty exam that they offer, which is a legal test. RID had one too, which after you had your generalist certification for a period of years, and you could prove some training and experience and supervision, you were allowed to take a written knowledge test and then an interpreted skills portion, a skills test. And then you were legally certified. That examination was put into a moratorium in 2016. So it's caused great problems, not only for courts, but for anyone who's looking for specialty interpreters who have not only been tested in their ability to interpret, but have the knowledge necessary to work in specialty settings. So what we're left with is a generalist examination that specifically excludes legal content. So what most courts and states are doing is asking interpreters to document years of experience, the different settings of legal work that they have done, any supervision that they've had in working in courts and legal settings, and various training that they've taken on different content areas, substantive areas of law, and procedural areas of law, and ethics. Of course, ethics is a big one for all interpreters, regardless of the language. New Mexico has been very active in providing training and recruitment efforts for both their generalist interpreters who want to become legal interpreters and for the people that they have in New Mexico who are already legally certified. But that's almost 10 years ago that it was sunsetted, so the pipeline is trickling. And so courts have really tried to be active in requiring interpreters to document their experience in order to allow them to work in their courts. We also have a category of interpreters who are different because they can't hear. So I can hear, obviously. I'm a certified ASL interpreter. And there are times when a specialist is indicated. And that is a deaf interpreter who holds a special general certificate in interpreting, not including legal work, and then has obtained additional training and experience and supervision in order to qualify to work in legal settings. We call them certified deaf interpreters, or CDIs. They function as a bridge between a deaf court user who is using a language or method that an ASL interpreter like me cannot understand. It happens for a lot of different reasons, but most often, and probably in border states like New Mexico, you see it more frequently than other places, when a foreign deaf person comes, uses their own sign language. Sometimes they don't have any language, but when they do use a sign language that is foreign, deaf specialists they're deaf. They grew up with the language. They have a way of being able to reach nuances that I will never be able to achieve. So some deaf specialists also know the foreign languages, but every country, and even within a country, there may be several versions of their sign language. So you would think, because British English and American English uses the same grammar, you would think that British Sign and American Sign would be very similar, and they're not. So just one example, if you're familiar with how deaf people spell letters to spell out proper nouns and names and things like that, that's called finger spelling, and we do it in the United States with one hand. In the UK, they do it with two hands. So that's just spelling words out. I mean, the actual lexicon that they use is very different. Historically, we came from France. So American Sign Language has more similarities to French Sign Language than it does to British Sign Language. So while a number of deaf interpreters, CDIs, know British Sign Language, they may know, it's not called Canadian Sign Language, it's the language of signs from Quebec. They might know that because they're bordering. There are many, many people here who now are deaf and use Central American, some kind of sign language, or South American sign languages, or Mexican sign languages. So if we don't have a CDI who knows the sign language, then we use a regular CDI and they suss out the content, but the details will be lost because they're not using the same language. There is an international, there's an international language that was created and it is used, but it has no native community using it. So it's used by academics who meet for international conferences. It looks a lot like American Sign Language, but it isn't, and it doesn't have a native community, so there is no spread. But parts of it are used in those kinds of situations, but it's very difficult to make communication happen. And I've touched on immigrants, but we have another issue. So an immigrant or any other person from any country who comes here, or generally it's when they come here and they have no language. So either they were not educated in their home country, or they were educated what we call orally, trying to teach them language by reading lips and speaking at them. And it was ineffective. So when they get here, they have no linguistic competence at all. Sadly, that group of people can be manipulated and used by criminals. I hate to say that, but that's the way I've seen it happen, where we had a recent case in Pennsylvania where a person from Central America was used to drive a truck that contained, I don't remember what it was, some kind of contraband, was arrested for a traffic violation on the freeway. And they found the drugs. They tried to interview this person and they had no language. And the court was at a real loss because they had no interpreters that they could provide. CDIs were not effective to establish communication with this person because they didn't have any concept of what a language was. I'm not sure what that happened to that individual. I know they weren't able to try him. There's another case that's fairly well known in Virginia, a gentleman named Osvaldo Martinez, who was arrested for a murder of a young girl back in, I think, 2004. And he was found to have no language. He was from Central America or Mexico, I don't remember. And so he had no language, so he couldn't go to trial. So they found that he was linguistically incompetent, and they put him into the state mental facility to teach him language. And they bring him back to court every 6 months to do an evaluation to see if he's now competent to stand trial. And he has never been made linguistically competent. And of course, there are people who suggest that that's intentional, that there's incentive for him not to become linguistically competent because then he would have to face a trial with pretty serious penalties in Virginia. So it's not, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. I can think of 15 to 20 cases, at least in my experience, where people who don't have any language interact with the court system, and the court's at a loss to be able to know how to provide them accommodations. The last example I'll give you is a gentleman named Junius Wilson. He was in North Carolina, and I don't remember what the original charges were, but he was committed to a mental institution because they found he was, and this is the term that they used at the time, nonverbal. And to me, what that meant is that he couldn't speak, and obviously he couldn't hear. But he stayed there for 68 years until a civil rights organization sued the institution. They had some linguists analyze what kind of language he really had. And what he was using is called the Raleigh dialect. So we have American Sign Language. We've recently had linguistic research into Black ASL. It's BASL. And it's a real dialect of American Sign Language, but it wasn't recognized for many, many years. It is now gaining recognition. But even what they found about Mr. Wilson was that the Raleigh dialect was this mix of BASL and Native American signing that was used there in the community. And his entire life was spent in a mental institution because he was misdiagnosed as having no language, when in fact he did have language. So. what's next? Deaf-blind folks. We have a lot of deaf-blind people, which is interesting, but we have a condition called Usher syndrome. And what happens is that people are born deaf and they learn sign language. And then over time, they start to lose their vision. It becomes tunnel vision. And eventually they become blind with retinitis pigmentosa is the eye condition that causes it. And so those people grow up learning sign language. And then when they start to lose their sight, they have to figure out how to communicate. So we have interpreters who do what's called close vision interpreting, where you sit very close to the deaf person and you modify your signing space. So you're signing very small and right up high, wherever this person's tunnel vision is. And then when that goes, they might start communicating by finger spelling. And so the deaf-blind person is holding on to the interpreter's hands, and you're finger spelling and signing, and they're physically holding on to you. It's terribly draining on the interpreter. And it's probably hard for the deaf-blind person too. But that's one way. Now, if a deaf-blind person became blind first, they would have never learned sign. And so you might have someone who's, if they know English because they can hear, they might be spelling using Braille. They might be spelling in the palm, like a physical kind of touch where you're actually spelling out words. So there's a whole range of the kinds of interpreters that are provided based on what are the actual visual needs of the deaf-blind person. And you always have more than one interpreter because it's so taxing to have somebody else's body weight on your shoulders. And deaf interpreters oftentimes will perform that function of actually being with the deaf-blind person, guiding them, helping them out in ways other than language, as well as interpreting for them. They get their access by an interpreter who can hear, or you more often see it in all deaf events. So the deaf-blind interpreter is watching, receiving language, and providing it to the deaf-blind person. And you provide more information than just the words. So if something happens environmentally in the room, then the interpreter is informing the deaf-blind person what's going on. So if the deaf-blind person is talking to a person who can hear, and the person who can hear is laughing for whatever reason, the interpreter includes that information in the interpretation. So the deaf-blind person has more access to it. I'm going to give you in a moment an example of a new language that has been created by the deaf-blind community in Seattle for themselves. And it's very interesting how they've taken ownership of this new thing and said, ASL worked for a while, but it doesn't work now. This is what we want so that we understand everything that's going on. But before we do that, there's another group that we call Deaf Plus. And that's people who have cognitive disabilities, or limitations that preclude language learning. And they're often in community-based residential facilities. We see them frequently in court because they have to come to court once a year and report on how they've been doing, what kind of activities they've been doing. It's sort of a conservatorship. And we provide interpreters. And then there are times when the deaf person cannot understand us at all, doesn't know we're there. Just depends upon the nature of their cognitive limitations. Other times they have some communication skills. So the interpreter has to work at figuring out, can they understand? What can they understand? How can I modify what I'm doing to ensure that they understand? Well, I thought I was done, but I'm not. So before the movie, a word about video remote interpreting services, video relay services. When the court provides a remote interpreter for a remote hearing, that's not what I'm talking about. That's an accommodation provided by the court that started because of COVID. What I'm talking about is a telephone system that is paid for by the Federal Communications Commission. And they hire companies, the companies hire interpreters. A deaf person has a video phone, which is a computer terminal, a monitor. They can call through the internet and connect with an interpreter. And the interpreter will call their lawyer, their doctor, their mother, whoever they're calling, and interpret a conversation. Many of those interpreters are simply not qualified. They're certainly to do legal work. VRS, that's what it's called, a VRS company. They compete for interpreters. It's a very demanding job. You're on the phone at a call center, getting call after call after call. They're watching how many minutes you use, and it's a real high stress job. So there's a lot of burnout. So companies hire students, they hire non-certified interpreters, they hire anybody they can because they get paid by the minute. So in practicing law, I really want you to beware of communicating with your client through these services, through VRS. It's good for things like come to court at this time in that courtroom, but substantive conversations with your client on VRS, it's very dangerous. I've used VRS to talk to clients before and seen the amount of misunderstanding and miscommunication that can happen because the interpreter is likely somewhere. It could be anywhere. If you're making a call overnight, the interpreter is probably in the Philippines. So just be aware of that as an attorney, that you want to do the substantive, important, critical conversations in person with an interpreter. Right. So let's take a look at this video that I teased.
Oscar Serna is speaking in a brand new language. Oscar is both deaf and blind, or deaf-blind. He works at Gallaudet University on a project tracking the evolution of a language for those who can't see or hear. This new language is called Protactile ASL. The ASL stands for American Sign Language, which uses visual signs for words and phrases. Protactile ASL communicates entirely through touch. For example, here's a sentence in ASL. Here's how Oscar would say the same sentence in Protactile ASL. Historically, deaf-blind people communicated through American Sign Language, Braille, and fingerspelling, where each letter of each word is signed into a person's hand. Helen Keller, maybe the world's most famous deaf-blind person, used fingerspelling. But those are limiting, especially when deaf-blind people want to talk to each other. Protactile ASL emerged in the early 2000s as once isolated deaf-blind people began to form communities. Deaf-blind people have been adapting American Sign Language and adding gestures for things many languages don't have words for. For example, this tap on the hand is like nodding. The language has been evolving ever since.
Now, what's new in Protactile is that we're seeing things that were used in visual sign language be transitioned from the use of space to the use of the perceiver's body.
Traditional theories of language defined it as something seen or heard, but Protactile ASL proves that language can also be communicated through touch. And for the people speaking it, it allows for a life with richer communication.
Since I became Protactile, all of the channels have opened up. Information flows freely. It's like going from dial-up to broadband.
So that's Protactile. I don't personally know it. I had an opportunity just now to look at the chat box, and we're very fortunate we have John Pletcher on the meeting. He's a deaf specialist interpreter from the Seattle area, and he was doing some explaining of what I was talking about, but he also probably uses protactile. Again, if you have any questions about it, we'll take them in the chat box as time permits. I wanted to talk a little bit more. Let's see where we are. Can't act. Okay. About English. I've said that it is different in terms of the structure of the language as is ASL. The reason I use this slide in this example is because in a lot of the trainings that I have done, people have asked me, well, why should we get an interpreter? Why don't we just write notes? And so that's why I spend a lot of time on how and when deaf people became deaf. But I wanted to give you an example of the actual grammar, which is on this slide. If you had a note, and the note said John is at fault in English, we would understand that John must have done something wrong. In American Sign Language, because of our grammatical structures, it's exactly the opposite. Mary's at fault, John's upset, and then there's a pause in American Sign Language, and then there's a statement, and Mary did it, or Mary's at fault. So if you were just writing notes with a deaf person and they didn't know English, they would use their grammatical structure of ASL to understand what they were reading. They'd superimpose the ASL structure onto the written statement. So we have to be very careful. That's not the only way to say it in American Sign Language, but a very common sentence structure for us is called cause and effect, or you sign the topic first, you wait a minute, you pause, and then you provide a body shift and a comment on the topic. So if I said something like in English, the boy was shocked when he saw the blood on the floor. In ASL, under this sentence structure, you would have to sign first that there's a floor and there's blood on it, and then the boy has to come into the room, see it as a reaction, and then finally be shocked. So just keep that in mind when you're writing notes, that it isn't always effective and there will be misunderstandings. And that's why even the regulations to the ADA say you can use writing notes, but only for non-technical, simple, non-emergency kind of low-risk interactions. So again, writing notes is not a good idea unless the deaf person asks for it. Again, some deaf people are very, very literate in English, or it's a non-complicated case like court dates, courtrooms. And then I also wanted, just because this is timely, and I think it emphasizes why having an accommodation, lots of times when you look on TV, if there's a FEMA announcement, or if during COVID, there were a lot of governors' press conferences, and you'd always see an interpreter right next to the speaker. And that interpreter, by the way, was usually deaf. And there was an interpreter like me sitting in front of them, listening to the English, signing to the deaf interpreter, who would then sign it to the camera. And people often think, well, why do we need that when we have captions? And that's when, let's have the next slide, Anne, please. I don't mean to be political. But this is a recent tweet from Elon Musk. What's the point of sign language in a video if you've got captioning or subtitles? And that's because people don't understand that captioning and subtitles works great if you know English. Right? The tweet caused a great ruckus in my community, but I don't use it for that purpose. I use it because it's a real common misunderstanding. All right, let's take the next slide. I want to talk about logistics. So you're representing a deaf client and you're going to be working with interpreters. Interpreters have some needs. And they're a little bit different from spoken language interpreters, mainly because it's a visual language. We have to be facing who we're talking to. So the placement in court is different from a spoken language interpreter, who now with equipment might be across the room from the person who's using their services. But we tend to need to stand in front of the deaf person, which is in the well of the courtroom, with our back to the judge. Sometimes the bailiff doesn't like that. I've had bailiffs tell me I was not permitted to stand in the middle of the courtroom because they're familiar with spoken language interpreters who don't do that. And most people are very wary of just about walking across the well of the courtroom. When I'm working with a deaf witness, I'll be also in the well, but I'll be facing the deaf witness. So we move around a lot. If I have a deaf juror, again, I'll be in the well, but I will be facing the juror. Interpreters are taught that it's critical that they don't block the view of the judge to the witness or the jury to the witness. Otherwise, there's not many rules, except when you're using exhibits or videos like body-worn camera. The interpreter should, and they should be given time to move and to stand next to whatever the exhibit is. Because as we'll learn, deaf people process information visually. So if you're talking about something and pointing at it, they're watching the interpreter to listen to what you're saying, and they'll miss the pointing references that you're using. So it's always a good idea to point at what you want, say what you want, and alternate, or the other way around. Say what you want and then point at what you're talking about on whatever visual demonstrative piece of evidence you're working with. Interpreters also work in tandem, in teams, not only to relieve each other because it's tiring, mentally tiring more so than physically tiring, but also they serve as a check on the accuracy of each other. If I'm unsure what the deaf witness is saying, I will look to my team and check my understanding and then render the interpretation. My team might be standing across from me. They might be, standing next to me. I'm sitting. I'm old enough that I sit most of the time if I can. Or they might be standing across from me behind the deaf person. But again, we need some freedom to move, and sometimes that means getting permissions. When there's a deaf interpreter in the room, they're the one standing across from the deaf person. And I'm the one standing behind the witness or behind the deaf person, so that the deaf person isn't confused by seeing two different sets of interpreters in front of them. Interpreters also need some preparation that is not much different than spoken language interpreters, I would assume. We want the most recent statement of the claim. We're not allowed to talk to the deaf person and preview the factual basis for whatever they're there for. So whatever we can get in writing, demonstrating that basis, whether it's a charging document or an amended complaint, that will help us, because mistakes will happen. And as much preparation, as much we know about the case beforehand, we can reduce the frequency of those mistakes. Because, right, if I were interpreting a lecture for a deaf professor, I'd meet with them, I'd ask them what they're going to talk about, I'd see how they sign about that content, but I can't do that in court. So I'm going in colder. So as much preparation as I can get is helpful. I always ask for witness lists because our community is very, very small, and we know each other, and sometimes we know each other well. So I want to know who the witnesses are. I want to know who all the deaf people are in the case, so that I can disclose any prior contact that I have with the deaf person, or in certain circumstances, not accept the assignment if I have too close of a relationship with them. If you're in a case where you have expert witnesses, it's helpful for us to be able to preview their reports if they're going to be reports. We need time with the deaf person ahead of time to figure out what their language preferences are. We don't talk about the case. You're welcome to be there. You should be there to make it appear as if it's a privileged conversation. Even though we're not interpreting, we're asking them, where are you from? Where'd you learn? Like, we don't really ask, where'd you learn language? We figure it out. But we need time to do that. Sometimes we want to give short instructions to the deaf person if they've never worked with an interpreter. Deaf people are typically not used to us using consecutive interpreting. Unlike spoken language interpreters, it appears to be easy to use simultaneous, where we're signing at the same time somebody is talking. It appears to be easy to do that. But I'm telling you, we have research that shows the error rate is unacceptably high when we're simultaneous interpreting. But it appears easy to do because we don't have two languages overlapping each other. So sign language interpreters should use consecutive interpreting modes, just like spoken language interpreters do. But deaf people aren't used to us doing that. And so it's helpful for us to have an opportunity to explain that ahead of time. I'm going to skip some things, except not this. I always ask for a copy of jury instructions ahead of time so that I can prepare for them. And you should be aware that ASL privacy issues are very different from representing a client who can hear. In sign language, we can be on the second floor and see another person having a conversation and understand what they're saying. So as an interpreter, I will often tell the attorney when we're out in the hallway talking about the case, talking to a witness, I will let them know if there are other signers in the immediate environment and let them know that those people can understand what you're saying. It's always better to be in a witness room if you can, but if you can't, at least recognize that what the interpreter is telling you is not just that there are deaf people around, but there are deaf people around and they understand what you're saying. Likewise, in a court, when there's been a rule on witnesses, and I've seen this happen a lot, when there's a deaf person out in the waiting room waiting to come in, and they'll be watching through the window. And as a court interpreter, I see them watching. If you saw them watching, you would think that they're waiting for it to be called. But I see them and think, not only are they waiting to be called, but they're understanding what is being said, which is, the reason they're out there in the first place. There's remote interpreting is very difficult for sign language interpreters, myself included. ASL is a three-dimensional language. It uses space. It needs to be viewed from all sides. And video interpreting is a 2D space. So our space is flattened out. There are always more errors with remote interpreting. And my court loves remote interpreting. It's not going away. But I just want you to be aware that if you have an opportunity to do it in person as opposed to remote, the interpreters will thank you and they'll be more accurate. And with some, you have to. You have to with a deaf-blind case. You have to with someone who's deaf plus or has other additional challenges. So I definitely wanted to get that out. We have 5 minutes left, and I really want to take any questions I can. I had some slides on ethics, and the reason I included them was to point out two things. One, that deaf people, if there's more than one deaf person in the room, there will be communicating going on. So if the deaf person's in the audience and your deaf witness is on the stand, be cognizant that there can be and often is communication between the two of them. Now, I, as an interpreter, if I see it or notice it, I will inform the court. but you should know that as an attorney too. And the other scenario dealt with the fact that we're in a very small community, and deaf people have cultural rules. When I greet a deaf person, we will hug. That's what we do. It's very kinesthetic kind of vibe going on. There's a lot of touching. That doesn't mean the same thing to the deaf community as it does to the court community. So if you see an interpreter becoming overly comfortable with a witness, you should maybe think about voir direing them to find out the nature of that relationship. I likely have time. I would like to jump to the last slide, which is my contact information. I'm happy to talk to people if they have questions. And I'm happy to take at least one question. And if I can't answer it, I'll refer it to John.
Thank you, Carla. It looks like John really did help us out with a couple of questions. Thank you so much, John. And if you ever want to move to New Mexico, John, we have fantastic weather, just so you know. We're happy to have you over here. We have a question from Johnny Jones, who's asking a very timely question. He says, what effect will AI have on future interpretation for the deaf-blind community?
I don't think AI will be effective for sign language users at all. Gallaudet had a science grant from the federal government, so I assume they no longer have that to work on AI type. What's the word? I can't remember the word for those little guys. But I don't think that that project has not yet proven effective. For deafblind, I don't know how that would work. I'm not the right person to answer it. I can't see it being effective because of the nature of touch. And with AI, what's that word? You know, the little cartoon characters who represent people in their AI. I don't see it working, but it's coming, right? AI is definitely coming. It's here.
Leah wonders if you're talking about an avatar.
Yes, thank you. I knew that was a word.
Thank you. Then the other questions, which are the ones that you already saw, Carla.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your Friday day. It's my Friday afternoon. And again, if you have questions, you should contact Peggy's office as well. But I am happy to answer questions too. So have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Carla. As always, it is a pleasure. Always learn something new when I speak to you. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be sending out more information about some trainings we're going to be doing in June. Thank you so much.